In the golden, late summer weeks of 1940, as the smoke still cleared from the shattered beaches of Dunkirk and the capitulation of France left continental Europe in a state of geopolitical shock, the high command of the Third Reich faced a monumental strategic crossroads. Historically, Adolf Hitler's gaze was already drifting toward the vast, fertile steppes of the Soviet Union, viewing the British Isles as a stubborn obstacle to be quickly neutralized through air power or a desperate, risky amphibious crossing. Operation Sea Lion, the projected invasion of Great Britain, was scheduled for the autumn, while the Luftwaffe launched its full-scale aerial assault in the Battle of Britain to secure the necessary air superiority. Yet, behind the closed doors of the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder proposed a radically different, highly calculated alternative known as the Mittelmeerstrategie or the Mediterranean strategy. Raeder argued with fierce logistical conviction that Great Britain could not be defeated by a direct, costly frontal assault across the English Channel, where the Royal Navy maintained absolute local supremacy. Instead, he posited that the British Empire should be struck at its central logistical jugular, the Mediterranean basin. By seizing Gibraltar at the western entrance and the Suez Canal in the east, Germany could completely lock the British out of the Mediterranean Sea, severing the short transit route to India and Middle Eastern oil, and reducing the Royal Navy's global mobility to a fraction of its former power. Under this bold counterfactual scenario, Hitler embraces Raeder's vision, recognizing that securing the Mediterranean basin provides a safe, highly strategic southern flank before any future campaign in Russia is ever initiated. The immediate prerequisite for this grand Mediterranean design is Operation Felix, the capture of the British fortress rock of Gibraltar. In this alternate timeline, rather than being rebuffed by Francisco Franco's calculated neutrality during the Hendaye Conference, Hitler applies overwhelming diplomatic and economic pressure, threatening to sever Spain's vital grain imports and occupy the country by force. Franco, recognizing the futility of resistance against a continental hegemon, formally joins the Axis or permits the passage of specialized German assault units through Spanish territory. In the winter of 1940, elite German mountain troops, supported by massive 24-centimeter and 30.5-centimeter siege batteries positioned on the heights of Algeciras, launch a devastating bombardment of the British fortifications. The Rock of Gibraltar, pounded by relentless heavy artillery and specialized Sturmpioneer assault detachments utilizing flamethrowers and shaped charges, falls to the Axis after a brief, bloody siege. The western gate of the Mediterranean is officially slammed shut, forcing the British Royal Navy's Force H to evacuate its anchorage and retreat into the Atlantic, leaving the western half of the inland sea entirely under Axis control. This strategic success triggers a massive geopolitical shift as the Vichy French regime in North Africa and the Levant, now completely isolated from British influence, aligns its colonial apparatus even closer with the conquering German forces, providing a secure, uninterrupted overland supply line from Morocco to Tunisia. With the western gate at Gibraltar secured, the Axis High Command immediately turned its attention to the central Mediterranean, where the tiny, heavily fortified island of Malta remained a lethal British thorn in the side of Axis maritime supply lines. Historically, British submarines and torpedo bombers operating out of Malta sank up to 70% of the shipping carrying fuel, ammunition, and replacement engines to the Axis forces in North Africa, creating a chronic, terminal logistical bottleneck. In this alternate timeline, Germany does not postpone or cancel the planned airborne and amphibious assault on the island. Instead, in early 1941, Operation Herkules is launched with absolute strategic priority, deploying the full weight of the elite Fallschirmjäger divisions alongside specialized Italian Marine units. Pounded by a continuous, crushing aerial bombardment from Luftflotte 2, the battered defenses of Malta are systematically overwhelmed by wave after wave of glider-borne infantry and sea-landed heavy tanks. The fall of Malta completely transforms the logistical reality of the Mediterranean campaign. For the first time, Axis shipping corridors between the ports of Naples, Taranto, and Tripoli are entirely unthreatened by Allied interdiction. Rather than deploying a small, undersupplied blocking force under Erwin Rommel, the Wehrmacht pours an entire Panzer Army, comprising 4 full-armored and 3 motorized infantry divisions, directly into the North African theater. These forces are supplied with a continuous, uninterrupted flow of fuel, spare parts, and munitions. The British Western Desert Force, facing an Axis armor concentration 3 times larger than historical reality and suffering from chronic supply delays as their own merchant shipping is forced to circumnavigate the entire African continent via the Cape of Good Hope, is rapidly overwhelmed. The Axis forces surge across the Libyan desert in a relentless, logistically secure blitzkrieg, capturing Tobruk in weeks. By the spring of 1941, Axis armor reaches the gates of Alexandria. A desperate British defense along the Nile Delta is shattered as German engineers quickly bridge the river, bypassing the primary British defensive lines and capturing the ancient port of Alexandria. Within days, Axis motorized units race south to occupy Cairo and the Suez Canal, blowing up the lock systems and scuttling blockships to render the canal impassable to Allied shipping. The shattered remnants of the British Mediterranean fleet are forced to abandon their bases at Alexandria and flee south into the Red Sea, completely losing their ability to project power or protect the eastern Mediterranean, leaving the entire basin an Axis lake. The capture of the Suez Canal and the collapse of the British presence in Egypt opened a vast, highly lucrative strategic corridor into the Middle East, a region rich in petroleum reserves but historically isolated from direct European conflict. The victorious Axis forces waste no time, surging northeast across the Sinai Peninsula into the British mandates of Palestine and Transjordan, where local British garrison forces are too weak and disorganized to mount an effective defense. Leveraging the collaboration of the Vichy French authorities in Syria and Lebanon, the Wehrmacht establishes massive logistical staging grounds on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. This positioning proves critical when, in April 1941, the nationalist Prime Minister of Iraq, Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, launches a coup against the pro-British monarchy. In our history, the Luftwaffe dispatched only a handful of obsolete aircraft to support the Iraqi uprising, allowing the British to quickly crush the rebellion from their bases in India and Jordan. In this scenario, however, a fully supplied and highly mobile German Panzer Corps, having crossed the Sinai and moved through Syria, surges directly into the Mesopotamian plain. The British forces in Iraq, heavily outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement by the loss of the Suez Canal, are swiftly defeated. The Wehrmacht secures the massive, high-grade oil fields of Kirkuk and Mosul intact, immediately providing the Axis with an abundant, localized source of crude oil, though the immediate challenge remains the lack of refining capacity and transport infrastructure to move this oil back to Central Europe. To secure their northern flank and prepare for the ultimate prize, the Wehrmacht pushes further east into the mountain kingdom of Iran. Historically, the Allied invasion of Iran in August 1941 was launched to secure the Persian corridor for Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union. In this alternate timeline, the Germans strike first, surging across the Iranian border. The primary tactical obstacle is not the weak Iranian army, but the forbidding, snow-capped peaks of the Zagros Mountains. This rugged terrain, characterized by narrow dirt roads, steep passes, and a complete absence of modern railway connections, severely tests the limits of German motor transport. Nevertheless, through brutal determination and the specialized mountain engineering of the Gebirgsjäger divisions, the Wehrmacht secures the mountain passes and descends into the western plains of Iran, capturing the colossal Abadan refinery on the Persian Gulf, the largest oil refining facility in the world. With Abadan and the oil fields of western Iran under Axis control, the southern gateway to the Soviet Union's underbelly is officially flung wide open. By June of 1941, the grand strategic plan of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reached its ultimate, highly coordinated climax as the focus of the war shifted back to the Soviet Union. On June 22nd, the main forces of the German army launch Operation Barbarossa across a massive frontier stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. catching the Red Army in a state of near-total tactical surprise. However, unlike our history, where the Soviet Union faced a single, massive threat from the West, the Kremlin is now presented with a catastrophic tactical dilemma: a fully prepared, highly mechanized second front opening on their southern border. An Axis army group, compiled of seasoned German mountain divisions, specialized motorized units, and Italian motorized forces, is concentrated in northern Iran around the logistical hub of Tabriz, pointing directly at the Soviet Caucasus. To meet this unprecedented threat, the Soviet Stavka is forced to split its precious strategic reserves, preventing them from transferring the vital armies of the Transcaucasus Military District to reinforce the collapsing defenses of Ukraine and Belarus. In late June, as German panzers sliced through Soviet lines in the west, the southern Axis pincer strikes, surging across the Arax River into Soviet Azerbaijan and Armenia. The rugged, mountainous geography of the South Caucasus, dominated by the towering Lesser Caucasus Range, presents a formidable defensive barrier, but the Red Army forces in the region are chronically undersupplied, having been denied reinforcements due to the massive crises unfolding around Smolensk and Kiev. German mountain troops, utilizing their extensive experience from the campaigns in Norway and the Alps, bypassed the primary Soviet road checkpoints by scaling the high mountain passes, leaving the Soviet defensive lines in the valleys isolated and vulnerable to encirclement. Motorized German divisions, advancing along the Caspian coastal plain, push rapidly toward the north, brushing aside the disorganized and fragmented Soviet rearguard actions. The Red Army's ability to defend its southern territory collapses as air superiority is quickly established by the Luftwaffe, which utilizes newly secured airfields in northern Iran to launch devastating tactical strikes against Soviet command centers and rail junctions throughout the Caucasus. In the late summer of 1941, the Southern Axis pincer reaches its ultimate, high-value strategic target, the oil-rich metropolis of Baku on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Historically, Baku was the single most important economic prize on the Eastern Front, producing over 80% of the entire Soviet Union's crude oil and high-octane aviation fuel. Without this massive petroleum output, the Soviet war machine simply could not function, as its vast fleets of tanks, combat aircraft, and logistical trucks were entirely dependent on the Baku oil fields, as was the heavily mechanized agricultural sector that fed the nation. In our timeline, the Wehrmacht was stopped over 300 miles away in the high peaks of the Caucasus during the summer of 1942. But in this alternate reality, the southern offensive, launched from secure bases in Iran and bypassing the high mountains via the Caspian coast, enters the outskirts of Baku by August 1941. Desperate Soviet attempts to demolish the hundreds of oil wells and refineries before retreating are only partially successful, as rapid encirclement by German motorized units prevents systematic destruction of the extraction infrastructure. The fall of Baku deals a mortal, paralyzing blow to the Soviet Union's ability to wage a modern, mechanized war. Within weeks, a chronic, nationwide fuel famine begins to strangle the Red Army. Soviet tank brigades are reduced to static defensive boxes, unable to maneuver or counterattack due to empty fuel tanks, while the Red Air Force is practically grounded, leaving the skies completely open to the unchallenged dominance of the Luftwaffe. Even more catastrophically, the Soviet agricultural heartland is paralyzed as thousands of tractors run out of diesel, triggering immediate food shortages that threaten the survival of the population behind the Urals. Starved of fuel and unable to deploy high-mobility reserves, the Soviet defenses in the west crumble. The German Army Group Center, facing a paralyzed and immobilized opponent, surges through the outer defense rings of Moscow, capturing the Soviet capital by October 1941 and pushing the remnants of the Soviet government far to the east. The fall of Baku and the subsequent collapse of the Central Soviet state marks the apparent absolute triumph of the Mediterranean strategy, delivering the resources of the East into the hands of the Axis. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of this seemingly absolute strategic triumph lay a harsh, unyielding logistical reality that would ultimately transform the Axis conquest of the Middle East and Baku into a devastating terminal trap. In military history, capturing an oil field is only the first, easiest step. The far more complex challenge is refining that oil and transporting it thousands of miles back to the industrial core of the homeland. Historically, Germany's coal-centric chemical industry was built to produce synthetic fuels, and its logistics were designed around high-density rail networks, not long-distance maritime tanker transport or desert pipelines. With Baku, Mosul, and Abadan in Axis hands, the Wehrmacht faced the insurmountable problem of how to move millions of tons of crude oil to Central Europe. The Black Sea was highly vulnerable to Soviet minefields and surviving naval units, while the Mediterranean, although closed at Gibraltar and Suez, remained under constant threat from British naval forces operating out of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, which successfully blockaded any attempt to ship oil via tankers through the Suez Canal. This left only two potential transport routes: overland pipelines or railways. However, the railway networks of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq were extremely sparse, utilized non-standard gauges, and possessed a fraction of the rolling stock needed to haul heavy industrial tonnage. The Trans-Iranian Railway, completed in 1938, was a single-track engineering marvel that climbed over 7,000 feet through the Zagros Mountains via hundreds of tunnels and bridges, a line that was incredibly fragile and easily paralyzed by even minor local sabotage. Operating this railway at high capacity required thousands of specialized locomotives and heavy tank cars, assets that Germany simply did not possess and could not transport to the region. Furthermore, the pipelines crossing the vast Syrian and Iraqi deserts were highly vulnerable to constant sabotage by local nationalist groups, British commandos, and surviving Soviet partisans, requiring entire armies of Axis security forces to guard thousands of miles of exposed infrastructure in hostile territory. The Wehrmacht's truck transport fleet, already decimated by the brutal heat, blowing sand, and primitive mountain tracks of the Middle East, suffered from a terminal shortage of tires and replacement engines, grinding to a halt across the vast distances of the desert. In the end, the conquest of the Middle East proved to be a magnificent logistical mirage. Germany had spent its precious, irreplaceable armored reserves and fuel to conquer a vast, empty empire that it could neither secure, supply, nor integrate into its economy, leaving its forces overextended, brittle, and highly vulnerable to the crushing industrial might of the United States when it ultimately entered the global conflict.